And tonight we examine a moment of deep restructuring inside the American and Western politics, a moment where the old moral authority of liberal interventionism is collapsing, while a new generation on the left is attempting to redefine what global justice actually means. On one hand, we have the rise of the liberal hawks, a powerful network of policymakers, commentators, and strategic think tanks who today defend the projection of the Western power abroad under the name of democracy. They present Ukraine today the way previous generations portrayed Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, not as the result of great power strategy, but as a moral crusade. On the other hand, inside the United States itself, we are witnessing a new political force emerging within the Democratic Party. This new left is no longer confined to campuses and student unions, as in the 1960s. It is found in labor unions, community organizations, and elected lawmakers who reject the idea that American foreign policy can continue to preach democracy overseas while supporting siege and occupation in Gaza, inequality at home, and the erosion of working-class political power. And yet, between these two forces, there is not only disagreement, but an open battle for the soul of the American left. And I'm Salma El-Feki, and this is In Focus. The transformation of American liberalism on questions of war and military power is striking. During Vietnam, it was the left, students, clergy, civil rights leaders who led the resistance to U.S. militarism. But today, many of the loudest voices defending large-scale military assistance to Ukraine, the NATO expansion, and the continuation of the unconditional aid to Israel are liberal commentators, centrist Democrats, and institutional foreign policy elites. This shift did not happen in a vacuum. The military itself has changed, diversifying, professionalizing, and becoming one of the few remaining large state institutions. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's open contempt for military leadership alienated the old Republican hawks, and the war in Ukraine offered a new narrative, a morally clean war against fascism. Yet, when the same moral framework is applied to Gaza, the consensus fractures. Why is one occupation unacceptable and the other untouchable? That is the question shaping the future of the American left. And we're joined now by Mr. Meher Nicholas Fertzli, the director of the EU-ASEAN Center, an expert on global economic governance and the strategic realignments reshaping Eurasia and the Indo-Pacific. Welcome, Mr. Fertzli, and thank you so much for joining me here today at In Focus.
My pleasure.
Mr. Meher, how do you explain the ideological inversion where many liberals they now champion military power while the right grows more isolationist?
Yes, it's a paradox. It's a paradox. It's a strange paradox. And it was, to a large extent, invisible, right? So we had that paradox, but it was not obvious because both big parties, the Republicans on the right and the Democrats on the left, were controlled by similarly motivated foreign policy, national security intellectuals. So inside the Democratic Party, they were called liberal hawks, as-suqur liberaliyin. And inside the Republican Party, they were called neocons, neoconservative. But in reality, when it comes to military deployment, foreign wars, pro-NATO, pro-Israel, blah, 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 they were very similar. And that's why people in the Middle East or Europe were shocked when they saw, when she was a senator, when she was, I think, for 9 years or 10 years, a US senator, Hillary Clinton was very close to Dick Cheney and George Bush on foreign policy and military affairs. And many people in Europe and the Middle East said, oh, it doesn't make sense. But it makes sense if you know the intellectual history of the Democratic Party. And for many years, that party was very hawkish, hence the term liberal hoax. And, it's a nice coincidence in a way. The two events are not connected, but sometimes in history and geopolitics, you have two disconnected events which happen at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. So Mamdani won a surprise victory in New York 6 or 7 days ago, and completely disconnected, 3 days ago or 2 days ago, Nancy Pelosi announced that she would retire in the coming days. And it's very interesting as a character, Nancy Pelosi, the all-powerful leader of the Democratic Party in the House. Why is it interesting? She's the daughter of Thomas D'Alessandro. And you could say back in the 1930s and 1940s, Thomas D'Alessandro was one of the original liberal hoax. It's interesting. His daughter controlled, to a large extent, the Democratic Party until 2 days ago. That's really fascinating. And so, to make a long story short, why a big chunk of the Democratic Party was pro-war, pro-NATO, and pro-Israel, it had to do with the Cold War. In 1945, not only, Soviet Russia controlled half of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, but the communist parties in Italy and Greece were very strong, right? And many of the Democrat voters in the big cities like Baltimore or New York or San Francisco were white ethnics. What does it mean, white ethnics? It means Italian American, Polish American, Greek American, Irish American. And these people, knowing that the Communist Party was very strong, in Rome, Milan, Athens, were afraid for their home country, right? They were afraid for their home country being taken over. And for the Polish people of, the Midwest and Pennsylvania, their country had already been invaded. And so naturally, left-wing working class voters of Irish, Italian, Greek origin, they became naturally liberal hoax. It's not the only reason. The other reason is the elite, the rich Harvard and Princeton educated liberals back in the 1940s and 50s, they hated communism even more than the Republicans, which sounds strange. So they were the elite, the blonde, blue-eyed Anglo-Saxon elite, center-left at home, but abroad, very pro-NATO and very pro-Israel.
Sir, to what extent is this shift, do you think, driven by Trump's conflict with the Pentagon rather than a principled ideological change?
So here, the liberal press, right, the liberal hawkish press, so typically that would be, the New York Times, for example, the Washington Post, the Atlantic magazine. So these guys, they're liberal hoax, and they really hate Trump. So of course, they're framing the debate. They're exaggerating the debate, and they're saying, there is a crisis brewing inside the Pentagon. I think it's wildly exaggerated, but it's linked to Trump differently. So it has nothing to do with Trump firing a few incompetent generals and admirals, but it's linked to Trump indirectly, because what did Trump do to gain power and to enter the White House 9 months ago? The second Trump presidency, once again, is very different from the first one, because in the second Trump presidency, he was able to get rid of the neocons inside his own party, people like John Bolton, right? And now he's really Trump. Now he's really an American nationalist, a neo-Nixonian American nationalist to the full, which he was unable to do 8 years ago, because in his first term, we had many senators and MPs on Capitol Hill who were neocons. So to make a long story short, the left, the new left, is watching the Republicans, right? And they say, oh my God, we thought it was impossible to get rid of the pro-NATO, pro-Israel, neocon establishment inside the Republican Party. Trump was able to do it. He eviscerated them. He eliminated them to a large extent. Why can't we, the Democrats, do the same inside our own party? So now you have many grassroots leaders, not only Ocasio-Cortez and Mamdani in New York. You have many trade union leaders, labor organizers, municipal councilors across America. They're saying, let's do the same. Let's get rid of our own quote unquote evil bastards. Let's get rid of the liberal, hawkish Nancy Pelosi, Clinton, Biden elite inside our own party. So that's very interesting because even though they don't like Trump politically, they are taking part of their inspiration from Trump.
If you can explain to us a little bit, Mr. Ferdinand, now Ukraine is framed as a clear moral struggle, whereas Gaza is framed as complex. What does this double standard tell us about the liberal hawk foreign policy?
Yeah, in my opinion, it's not about good or bad.
Why do we see this double standards, basically?
But there is a double standard. So there is an unjust, in my personal opinion, there is a very unfair, unjust double standard.
Yes.
But being a realist, or being myself a neo-realist, I don't view it in moral terms. But why is there a double standard? Because of course, if you look, ceteris paribus, so like for like, relative to the size of Ukraine,
okay,
in percentage term, right, and relative to the size of Russia, comparing apples and apples, not apples and oranges. Of course, the Israeli armed forces, they killed many more civilians in Khan Yunis, Gaza, Beit Lahem, Ramallah, Al-Arih, Jericho, than, ceteris paribus, the Russians did in eastern Ukraine, right? So then in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, across the world, they're saying, oh my God, there is a double standard.
But sir, this still doesn't explain the double standards. Why do we have the double standards in these two, the Ukraine and Gaza we're seeing?
Because it's due to history. You remember, what I said, Thomas D'Alessandro, Nancy Pelosi's father, blah, blah, blah. Why history? Because when the Democrat Party was reorganized in 1945-46, the white ethnics, the Polish, the Italian, the Irish, the Greeks, to build a coalition, they had to find allies, right? And so they wanted America to fight communism in Rome, Napoli, Warsaw, and Athens. And you had many Jewish voters, and back then, 95% of American Jewish voters, it's a lot, right? 95%, they voted for the Democratic Party, and they hated the Republican Party back then because they thought the Republicans were racist and pro-German or whatever. And so to build a coalition, the Italian, Polish, Greek MPs or senators, they told the Jewish senators, look, we'll back you on Israel if you back us for NATO and against communism. So it's an alliance of circumstance, right? So to build a coalition, a liberal, hawkish coalition, they had to bring together many interest groups. Another lobby or interest group is in Democrat majority states, you had many weapons factories, right? And after 1945, you had to justify keeping, the weapon factories on after the defeat of Germany. So having Russia or communism as a new boogeyman or enemy was good for them because you could justify building, weapons and missiles. And in many of these states, the majority of voters were actually Democrats, working class Democrats. They wanted to keep their job working for Raytheon or McDonnell Douglas and to build, military hardware. So they also wanted justification. So domestically in America, there was a domestic national alliance between different lobbies or different pressure group to support NATO and support Israel. And President Truman was the incarnation of that new liberal hawkish stance.
Well, Mr. Ferdsley, I'm going to come to my next question, which is also related to the American left hawk alignment. How does Europe, especially France, Germany, and Eastern Europe, view this new American left hawk alignment?
Well, they are afraid because in the ruling party, so inside the governing establishment, the elites in Berlin, Brussels, Paris, London, the conservative right is very much neocon. And the center left, like Emmanuel Macron, for example, they are very much liberal hawks, right?
Yes.
So they love Harry Truman, they love Nancy Pelosi, they love George Bush and Dick Cheney. So they're horrified in Europe after Trump eliminated the neocons inside the Republican Party. Now they're even more horrified because the likes of AOC and Mamdani and their many disciples want to eliminate the pro-NATO, pro-Israel liberal hawks inside the Democratic National Committee. Yep. So really, this is frightening Europe, and many in Europe are lost, and they're telling themselves that they no longer understand America because they don't want to understand America.
But do you think the new left inside the Democratic Party could actually eventually challenge and displace the liberal hawks, similar to how Trump may have displaced the neoconservatives in the GOP?
Yes, I think yes. I think it will take a little more time and more effort. So, what Trump did was not easy. And look, it took him 10 years, right? And Trump is a very hard fighter, very dedicated, very focused, animal. But even someone extraordinary like Trump, it took him, 10 years and a lot of bruises to reach that point, right? It will happen inside the Democratic Party, starting in the big cities. So starting, for example, New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Already at municipal level, we're seeing the old bourgeois, upper class, rich Democrats, we're seeing them collapse. And when they lose the big cities, after they lose, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, they already lost New York, and they will soon lose, Philadelphia. Then comes what? Then comes the state. And when they lose the state, they lose all the rest.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Ferdsley, the director of the EU ASEAN Center, for this insightful and structured analysis. And we will continue the discussion by looking inwards to how progressive civil society itself has changed and what has been lost along the way. And if foreign policy reveals the ideological divide at the top of the Democratic Party, then the crisis of the progressive civil society reveals the problem at the base. And the question is not simply what the left stands for, but who is it speaking to and who it has left behind. Over the past decades, unions, neighborhood organizations, and mass membership groups that once defined working-class political life in America have disappeared or hollowed out. And in their place, advocacy, NGOs staffed by university-educated professionals became the dominant voice of the left. And this is not simply a cultural shift. It has severed the left from working class, identities, values, and daily life, concentrating its language, strategies, and priorities on highly engaged, socially liberal, urban constituencies. The result? The right now speaks to communities the left once organized, and not because it offers solutions, but because it shows up. And with us as well is Ms. Ginger Chapman, the lawyer and political analyst specializing in the intersection between the U.S. social movements and the progressive organizing. Welcome, Ms. Chapman. Thank you so much for joining me here today at In Focus. And I will ask you, how do you think the American left lose its institutional ties to working class communities. If you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, thank you, Salma, for having me today, and greetings to your viewers. And what we are seeing in America is both major political parties are going through an upheaval and internal civil wars. We've seen the battles in the Republican Party between the America First faction and the Israel First faction. This is becoming a severe problem for President Trump. And on the other side, we are seeing an internal conflict in the Democrat Party. And this is because right now we're seeing the rise of centrist Democrats, more moderate Democrats, in addition to their extreme progressive Democrats. So for several years, we've seen the rise of Bernie Sanders, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Squad with Ilhan Omar, Rashid Tlaib. So we have seen for years the rise of progressive liberal Democrats. This is most expressed by Mamdani's victory in New York. He is sort of the culmination of liberal Democrat ideology. But we have also been seeing over the past year or two the rise of moderate Democrats, which is unusual. A great example of this is the new governor of Virginia, Democrat Abigail Spanberger, also the new governor of New Jersey, Mickey
And Ms.
Sherrill.
Chapman, why can you explain to us, why is this a phenomenon actually emerging? Why is this happening?
There are several reasons. First is it's a response to Trump. Trump had the mantle of being a peacemaker. So he was viewed as taking over the Democrat mantle of wanting to attain peace worldwide. This is backfiring on him. At the same time, the Democrats, they have always championed the working poor, working class people, welfare benefits, food, supplemental assistance. However, they have seen the popularity of President Trump's policies. So these Democrats that won on messages that echo Trump's, as far as needing to be more aggressive and warlike globally. So we're seeing a very interesting rise of neocon warhawk Democrats. We've seen this with Hillary Clinton. She was recently making a speech about the military needs to be more aggressive. We've seen Kamala Harris in her book rewriting President Biden's policies. And most importantly, the American people, particularly Democrats, saw that that Joe Biden, when he was president, he did whatever Israel wanted. In fact, his spokesman, Matt Miller, after Biden was out of office, went public with interviews saying that the Biden administration knew that Israel was undermining and sabotaging the ceasefires, and Biden did nothing about it. Biden called himself a great Zionist president. And so the Democrat voting population are getting increasingly angry at Democrat leadership because the Democrat leadership is incoherent. They do not have a unified message. On one hand, they actually used to promote the rights of Palestinians, but now we're seeing Democrats say that they need to be more on the side of Israel. This is because the Israeli lobbying group in America is getting more desperate, and the Israeli lobby group is getting more aggressive. They are spending more money. On the Republican side, they use AIPAC. On the Democrat side, they use the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, to control Democrats. And meanwhile, in
Ms.
Ukraine,
Chapman, can I move to my next question and ask you, please? Do you see any signs of a real realignment where the labor unions or the pro-Palestine solidarity groups and the economic populists, could they actually rebuild mass politics, do you think?
Well, all of these different groups are becoming more fragmented. We saw that the union groups, the trade groups, actually started speaking out in support of Republican policies
Yeah.
instead of Democrat policies. So essentially, what we are seeing is American institutions on all sides are becoming more fragmented. And surprisingly, these divisions within the Democrat Party over our role in the war in Ukraine, our role in the war in
In
Gaza.
Gaza.
The Democrats want to see themselves as champions of the poor, the downtrodden, the vulnerable, the indigenous people. However, there is pressure from the Democrat top to comply with the demands of the Israeli lobby because of the intensity of the war. So, no, these groups are not going to align. They are going to split further apart. We're seeing
Okay.
increasing fragmentation in the Democrat Party as well as the Republican
Yeah.
Party.
And Ms. Chapman, why does so much progressive mobilization now target already politicized, already engaged groups instead of maybe persuading new communities?
Well, because the groups that are already engaged are getting angrier because they feel a sense of betrayal. A great example of this is all of the college students earlier this year that were protesting, and then their own liberal Democrat administrators essentially turned them over to the Republican Department of Justice for investigation and prosecution. This is angering the Democrat base. So, um, and excuse me, I forgot the actual point of your question, but we're seeing increasing fragmentation. The Democrats want to view themselves as champions of the downtrodden, but they're being increasingly forced into defending the side they do not want to defend. The Democrats want to see themselves as standing up for the poor Ukrainians under attack by the Russians and the poor Palestinians under attack by the Israelis, but
Yeah.
they're big money donors are pushing
And
from
this
the
is
top down to
actually connected
reverse.
to my next question, Ms. Chapman, which is how can a movement that claims to represent workers when its internal culture is actually shaped by the elite education and urban class identity?
And this is why we're seeing a revolt of the working class, a revolt of the poor people against the perceived elites
Yes.
who are, they are getting rich and they are continuously dominating American policy in the exact opposite direction that the voters on both parties do not want to go in. So the voters are seeing the elite Democrats and Republicans becoming more warlike. They are getting bigger donations from the military industrial complex. And the voters are viewing the top Democrats and Republicans as the establishment. We see the Democrat Blumenthal joining forces with the Republican Lindsey Graham to promote increased war spending, increased militarization. Meanwhile, the poor people and the working class in both parties want these establishment politicians to focus on issues at home. And also, they're angry because we see American foreign policy is becoming more warlike towards Venezuela, Mexico, Nigeria, as well as the Middle East, Iran, Yemen. So the common people are seeing the rich on both sides of the political
A lot of
parties.
resentment.
Exactly. So we are seeing increasing division between the working class and the elite, as well as within the parties themselves.
And what does a practical roadmap, do you think, for rebuilding the working class political institutions actually maybe might look like? And who needs to lead it, do you think?
Well, one of the things we were seeing is the people are clamoring for a third party. And we saw earlier in Trump's second term where Elon Musk and Trump had a very big falling out, and Elon Musk said he was going to start a third party. Nothing became of that because third parties have to start from the ground up, not the top down. However, the American voters are increasingly unhappy and dissatisfied with the rulers of both parties. It remains to be seen. One thing that's surprising is we are seeing Republican voters say they will not vote for Trump or Vance until we see the military industrial complex influence removed. They are saying they will not vote for Trump as long as he is supporting the Israeli policies in Gaza. At the same time, we are seeing Democrat voters say they are not going to vote for their leaders as long as the Pelosi's, the Schumers are in control. And we're seeing fallout from this. We saw Nancy Pelosi announce her retirement after 40 years in Congress. So there is a shakeup at the top driven by the people at the bottom. However, it remains to be seen whether they can succeed because Americans are still apprehensive about increasing street violence and the possibility of civil
Ms.
war.
Chapman, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to thank you so much for joining me here today, Ms. Ginger Chapman, the lawyer and political analyst, for helping us map the deeper structural crisis shaping progressive politics today in the U.S. And the left today stands at a crossroad. It cannot fight for justice abroad while abandoning the communities who need justice inside the U.S. And it cannot confront authoritarianism overseas while ignoring occupation and siege in Palestine. Rebuilding political power requires re-anchoring movements in real institutions, real neighborhoods, real human ties, because the struggle for democracy, whether in Kiev, Gaza, Detroit, or Pittsburgh, must begin with the people who are living it. And that was In Focus, and thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more on Q News.